As of the recording date of this video, the detectives that I'm about to interview who pioneered the smiley face killer theory believe that there are over 700 men across America who possibly could have been murdered by this group of serial killers, whose deaths have been forgotten about, covered up, and whose friends and families have been silenced. In today's episode, we'll be discussing a few of these victims, telling their stories, and then visiting the locations of where their bodies were found in both Minnesota and Wisconsin in order to search for the dark answers ourselves. On today's episode, we're investigating the smiley face murders, a series of up to 700 possible murders that have taken place across the United States that have potentially been carried out by the same dark web murder syndicate. I'm sure you've heard the news stories before. First, it's a headline like, "Local man goes missing after drinking in downtown River District." A few days later, the headline reads, "Family pleads for help in locating missing son." And then, finally, sadly, a last headline, a few days later, reads, "Local man's body found floating in river." It's a pattern that we've seen occurring in multiple cities across America in the last few decades. In cities like Chicago, Nashville, New York, and Lacrosse, Wisconsin. In fact, I just did a similar documentary last year on a rash of similar drowning murders that have been occurring in Austin, Texas for the last few years that local authorities seem incredibly hesitant to acknowledge. I was with one of the victims of that crime spree on the evening that he went missing, in fact, and I know, deep down in my heart of hearts, that these are murders, not just accidents. And time, after these bodies are found, we hear the same stories, the same details. The victims are typically young, fit, and attractive. They're somewhat popular amongst their peers. They were usually star athletes in their high school and college years, and they seem to be incredibly intelligent. A lot of the victims have similar physical profiles and builds, similar interests, careers, and even similar degrees that they're seeking in college. But there's one ultimate factor that unites them all: death. And an even more disturbing factor that unites them even more distinctively, and that would be murder. According to authorities all across the United States, the men who are dying in America's rivers after nights spent drinking have almost all exclusively died by accident. They were too drunk and they fell into the river, skeptics claim. It's dark out there, and I knew someone one time who wanted to go swimming in the river when they were drunk. It's just young, dumb men being stupid and gambling with their lives. But what if that's not the case? What if these young men are actually all victims of a loosely interconnected national murder syndicate, colloquially known as the Smiley Face Killers?
So I've talked about it in the past. I'm a huge history nerd and I love learning about history, whether it's the darker sides of history like we cover on this channel, or more personal history like where did my family come from? What country did we originate in? Those are all things that I didn't really know before I signed up for MyHeritage. And even though today's episode was sponsored by MyHeritage, I have to say I do love the company and they've shown me some really cool things about my own family. To build out a family tree on MyHeritage, it's very easy. You just have to input some basic information about yourself. Right here, you can see I'm adding my picture, my name, getting that in there. And shortly afterwards, boom, there's your family tree. Now, it's really interesting. You can see my mom and dad right there. And you come over here, and I'm looking at members from my mother's side of the family that I didn't even know existed. Names I've never heard before. Siri Wold and Eric Haugen. I mean, when were these guys born and when did they die? And look at this, Eric Erickson. My mother's name is Mary Erickson Browen, so this is really interesting. My great-grandfather, obviously he died in 1934, so I never met him. I know some people online have met their great-grandparents, but it's so interesting. Look at children: Edith, Arthur, Selma, Lenora, Eric, Norman, and Frida. I didn't know that those were my grandfather's brothers and sisters. These are things I'm finding out right now live. Something cool about MyHeritage is that they have access to over 20 billion historical documents. So if you find your family members on there, you might find these documents that relate to your own family that you've never seen before. MyHeritage also makes it very easy to add members to your family tree and discover new things about your family through instant discoveries. Like right here, I've got a couple instant discoveries right here. Some family members here that I've never really heard of before. Oh, there's my grandpa. He's actually there. Let's view the discovery. Wow. Yep, that's my grandfather right there, Norman Erickson. He appears in a photo here on this website. I've never seen of him. I'm going to check that and add that. Something else that's really cool is you can look through all these documents yourself. As you can see right here in the history of Trempealeau County, Wisconsin of 1917. This old article that's been scanned in here mentions my mother's uncle's uncle. I mean, how cool is that? You can really dive into your family and discover who you are and where you came from. Through My Heritage, you can also upload old photos, you can enhance them, as you can see right here, which is super cool. Maybe you have some older pictures of older family members that you've never seen in color. I mean, just wow, look at the before and after of this picture. It just brings this stuff to life. I've been really enjoying my time on My Heritage building out my family tree, and I think that you will too. If you want to start researching your family history and building out your family tree, now is a great time to start. All you have to do is head to the link in the description of this video or in the pinned comment. It's my special link, and you can start setting up your family tree immediately. Once again, that's My Heritage. Anyways, let's get back to today's story. Well, first, we need to examine just who the smiley face killers are. I also want to add in here that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of college party towns spread out across America that are situated on rivers and lakes, where there are bar districts and areas where young men go out to drink all the time near the water. And in most of those towns, you don't have problems like the ones we're going to be discussing in this video. If in every single college town in America that's situated near a body of water, men were dying in these horrific drowning deaths at similar comparable rates, then I may be a bit more skeptical. But they're just not. There are hubs of murder in America, and we're going to be visiting a few of them today. According to retired New York City police detectives Anthony Duarte and Kevin Gannon, and their good friend and investigative partner Dr. Lee Gilbertson, a former criminal justice professor and gang expert at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, these drowning deaths can actually be attributed to a sinister gang known as, like I mentioned earlier, the Smiley Face Killers. Tony and Kevin gave this group that specific nickname because, at the start of their investigation into these crimes, they noticed that near almost every crime scene that they examined, they found smiley face graffiti. The first time they saw it, they didn't pay attention. The second time, they thought it was strange. But as they continued to examine these murders and kept noticing the smiley faces, the appearance of these logos turned from a creepy coincidence into hard evidence. According to Kevin and Tony, the Smiley Face Killers are a group of serial killers, torture fanatics, and sadomasochists that most likely initially organized with one another on the dark web. According to the theory, this group operates almost like a domestic terror group. They commit these murders with purpose and intent. On one hand, the members of this serial killer syndicate definitely seem to enjoy the act of murder, and they do enjoy torturing their victims. But on the other hand, there's a ritualistic element to these murders that forges a link between them all. According to Tony and Kevin, there seem to be groupings of these serial killers in multiple cities across the United States, and they form their own almost terror cells, if you will. Each of these serial killer groups in each respective city has its own leader, its management members, and its grunts, and every member seems to enjoy the torture and murder of young innocent men with bright futures. Think of the Smiley Face Killers as a sort of incel group, a group of frustrated, deeply disturbed young men, situated on the outskirts of proper society, young men who initially forged bonds on the dark web, where they at first discussed their darkest fantasies of murdering people, and then began to act out those fantasies in real life. It's thought by Kevin and Tony that there are over 1,000 identified members of these serial killer smiley face gangs spread out across America, which is a deeply frightening and troubling thought, especially since the authorities across the country don't believe in the possibility of the group's existence. But to tell you the full story of these murders and to fill you in on the details, I actually spoke with Anthony or Tony Duarte and Kevin Gannon myself, the two detectives who created the smiley face theory. They're pretty infamous in the true crime world, and I asked them the questions to which I was eager to have answers. And let me tell you, this story and this video gets incredibly dark.
I'm Anthony Duarte. Most people call me Tony. Retired NYPD. I was a detective in South Bronx. Worked on a lot of different cases, to include homicides and some federal cases. And after that, I retired 10 days before September 11th, and I went into the work for the government in the Homeland Security. Primarily during the time after September 11th, up till even this day, we've been working. When I say we, Kevin Gannon and I pretty much have been working on the Smiley Face Killers. So it's been coined. We're here today, and trying to keep this moving forward. Speaking to you.
All right, man. So how did the whole smiley face theory begin, really?
It actually started with Kevin when he was in a missing persons squad, and it was the Patrick McNeil case with him missing. Essentially, he was a Fordham University student who, of course, in college, you go out, he was out partying, and he disappeared from a bar in, I believe it was either Upper or Midtown Manhattan. And Kevin got assigned the case, and there were so many inconsistencies as to how he disappeared and where he was found that, he started telling me about it. And I know he made a promise to the family that when he retired, he was going to look into it and see how that went. So he told me about it. That was in 1997. As the years went on, we ended up retiring. Well, I left 10 days before September 11th by the grace of God. And we started looking into it. And again, there were so many inconsistencies as far as blood content and what was found that there must be more going on. And we just kept going and finding the same consistency over and over. Found in places where the body of water wouldn't take you, blood levels of GHB. I know GHB occurs naturally after death, but the amount that were found in some of these blood samples, it didn't fit. So that's pretty much how we started with the Patrick McNeil case.
So with Patrick, what were the inconsistencies that were noticed? Do you remember, specifically what those were?
Apparently, the hierarchy, the bosses in the missing persons squad, didn't want to do. It's a big thing to make a claim that someone's either kidnapped or we need more detectives to work on it. So the main focus was, look, the kid went out drinking and he fell in the East River, and that's that. But as it turns out, he had a witness with a vehicle that was supposedly circling the area. I believe they had a plate number even, or he got a plate number afterwards. I'm not sure exactly which. And nowhere in the investigation, I believe, is there a license plate number. It's virtually impossible from where the bar was in Upper Manhattan, fall in the East River there, and end up all the way Brooklyn at Owl's Head Pier, it's called. That's virtually impossible, and I spoke to the NYPD Harbor Unit, and those guys they know every single square inch of water in New York City, So and that was one of the inconsistencies.
So I am just going to let you introduce yourself, and then I've got just basic questions about the smiley face theory.
I was a ghostwriter for a decade, from when I was 21 to 31. Accidentally fell into true crime via John McAfee, the software guy. He created McAfee antivirus. Anyway, I was 25. Again, I had a weird life, a weird background. I was homeless on the streets of LA when I was a kid. I had a brush with who I believe was a serial killer, and that's what kind of f***ed up my life for a while. And I lost my mind and was kind of just traveling the world, this homeless, penniless, crazy in my mind vagabond. And ultimately, along this 4-month journey to Alaska, I got my mind back and I decided to be a writer. Eventually, when I was 25, I was kind of working in the crypto industry. I was I was ghostwriting white papers for companies, and I was fascinated by blockchain technology. I still am. Haphazardly, I guess, stumbled into the whole crypto world, where there are a lot of fakes, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of bullshit, there are a lot of scams, and then there are people like John McAfee. I was always fascinated by John because he's brilliant. I always thought that he was kind of misunderstood, a black sheep like me, like I was as a kid. I wanted to tell his story. Long story short, did the ghostwriting thing, ended up working with John as his biographer and had a lot of crazy experiences with him. Went on the run with him, allegedly from the Sinaloa cartel. I got kidnapped alongside him in Spain by who I believe was an Eastern European mob. I had to talk my way out of that situation and basically threaten them. I lied and said that my German cousin, was a member of Bundestag, the German parliament, and he was looking for me. And I was like, if he doesn't see my face in the next hour, he's going to send out an APB. Everybody's going to be looking for me. They're going to triangulate my cell phone service, and they're going to find me here at this creepy, decrepit place. And all you people with your guns are The bluff worked, man. I walked away and he had people follow me. I think I was on a hit list for a little bit. People wanted me dead because of what I had learned with John, some of which I talk about in that Netflix documentary, Running with the Devil. Anyway, that threw me into true crime. But all of the signs and all of the outside pressure and environmental aspects of it just kind of like made me walk this path. I started doing that after John, and things just started happening. So I ended up working the Long Island serial killer case for a year and a half, kept going on to New York, and I discovered that it was a group of men, of blue bloods, of very wealthy, powerful men who had been preying on women for decades, and that the true number of victims was a lot higher than what is currently known. And that these disparate people who were killing women over 25, 30 years, they at some point discovered that their predilections kind of coalesced and that they had the same predilection, and they started working together. And luckily for them, they were in such positions of power that they could obfuscate the details and the facts and the evidence to point the blame to other people. And that's exactly what they did. And I believe that's exactly what they're doing with Rex Heuermann. In Lisk, there was a snuff film ring for Lisk, and allegedly one of the Gilgo 4 was seen on a film that my ex-client co-author had seen. He stole it from the back of a chief of police's car and viewed the film, and allegedly on that film was a girl being tortured and murdered by men in masks, one of whom resembled the cop, the chief, and it was snuff film. When you actually talk to the families, when you talk to the victims' parents and their loved ones, their partners, their friends, and you see those tears in their eyes, and you see how real this is. They live through it every day. They have to. They can't just walk away from it. They can't go like Netflix and chill and just forget about it. Their loved one is dead in a horrible way. Usually they are raped and murdered, and they have to think about that. Then the same thing happened with Smiley Face Killers. Fell into it with Kevin Gannon. I guess that brings us to the present day. That's now I'm 32, and I don't ghostwrite books anymore. I just focus on writing true crime stories and writing books about them, and telling those stories and elevating those voices to the best of my ability. That's a long answer for an intro. I apologize.
So can you just kind of explain what the Smiley Face Killings theory is?
The Smiley Face Killer theory, promulgated by Detective Kevin Gannon and his team, like Tony, who you spoke with, alleges that there are young, college-age, predominantly white males all around America who have disappeared or gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, almost always after a night out at bars or parties, and they are found inexplicably in bodies of water, again under mysterious circumstances, oftentimes with no water in their lungs. But these cases are always attributed to drowning, death by misadventure, acute alcohol poisoning. They are not looked at or examined as potential homicides or abductions right from the start. So like 90% of the evidence gets lost in the weeks after these people are found, simply because they're not even examined. They're not even looked for. They're not even known that they exist, these pieces of evidence. And so that's the Smiley Face Killer theory. The smiley face factor comes in because allegedly there's smiley face graffiti found near or at sites of disappearance and body recovery sites. I take issue with that theory. In fact, I just take issue with the graffiti. I don't believe that it should be counted as relevant to all of these cases. I think it's highly circumstantial, and I think that it does a disservice to the phenomenon because people poke holes in it. I think we should be more so focusing on facts, evidence, and testimony instead of circumstantial evidence such as smiley face graffiti. I don't buy into that. In fact, I think the Smiley Face Killers is a misnomer. If I had my way, I would call them the Rivermen. That's what I call them, because in every single case, the one identifying factor that links them all together is a river or a body of water. So that's why I call them the Rivermen. I don't call them the Smiley Face Killers. The type of killings that happen are so sophisticated and organized that they have to be by a very intelligent group that knows what they're doing, knows law enforcement practices and methodologies of investigation, and knows how to kill people and cover it up. So I believe that there are these, very similar to the Long Island serial killer case that I was investigating, I believe that there are these disparate killers in the 80s, late 80s and 90s. They were killing people in different parts of the country. And during the advent of the internet age, when all these chat rooms started popping up and the internet became ubiquitous for all of us and we started using it and everybody was online. I think they found a commonality amongst each other, these killers, maybe in some chat room or something, before Big Brother was really like, watching everything we say and do. I think that they found camaraderie in killing. I think maybe it started as just joking at first, but then someone was like, wait, are you serious? They're like, yeah, that kid in Lacrosse, or the kid in Michigan, the kid in New York, yeah, that was me. It's really easy to kill people. You just have to make it look like it's a drowning. You have to make it look like it's an accident. It's so easy to do. I think these individuals started working together and they probably said, let's have a hunt, like in the Most Dangerous Game, right? Let's have a hunt. Let's choose a location somewhere that's close to us, and that would be very easy, somewhere that's highly populated, somewhere people go missing all the time. And let's do this. Let's work together and let's do this. And I think they chose New York City and Lacrosse and other places around the country in the late 90s. And I think they started killing together. They knew that if they had the perfect crime targeting the perfect victim profile. The perfect victim is a person who is allegedly drunk and college age. They're just another drunk college kid stumbling home from the bar, and they end up dead. They die of hypothermia, they fall in the river, and they just end up in the river and float somehow against the laws of physics 12 miles upstream. Makes total sense. But these guys, they realized if they chose the perfect victim and they elicited the perfect circumstances, that they could get away with murder. Because right from the start, these drownings and disappearances are looked at as just that, just drownings or drunk people falling into the river or dying of alcohol poisoning or something. That's what they're looked at. So right from the start, they are not examined as possible homicides and abductions. When they are examined as such, when some evidence comes out and some private investigators hired by the actual families of the deceased start looking into it and finding discrepancies and finding facts, evidence pointing to a homicide, the investigative agencies that were initially involved get scared. And this is why a lot of people are like, oh, they're cops, they're law enforcement, doing the killings. That's the only way. No, that's not true. But what is true is that when these are discovered, the discrepancies and the fact that these agencies aren't doing their jobs from the get-go, when this is discovered and shared to the public, these investigative bodies are like, oh, the kid was probably murdered. We wrote this off as a drowning. We're fucked. Our pensions are on the line. Our jobs, our careers, our families, it's all on the line now. We gotta go back and cover this shit up so that nobody knows. And that's what happens. And the killers know this. The killers are banking on this. It's quite brilliant, actually, that they know investigative practices and law enforcement methodology so acutely that they're banking for them to fuck up and then cover up their fuck ups. And that only further obfuscates the truth of their crimes. A lot of the times when these conspiracies happen, it's because the investigators tasked with investigating, they fuck it up and they're just covering their tracks. That's not even necessarily because they're involved in the killings or the disappearances. It's no, they didn't do their job, and they're gonna lose their job once people find out. So they gotta cover up the truth. It's what I call their twisted brilliance of this group. And I believe they are a group. I believe they are a very sophisticated, organized, intelligent group of people operating all over the country now, all over the world, potentially.
Wow. That information is, like I said before, incredibly dark and disturbing. I mean, the links are definitely there and the killers are yet to be caught. It's so sad to see justice continually be passed over for all of these victims' family members, as the local authorities seemingly try their hardest not to investigate these deaths as murders, and instead seem fixated on proving that these men died accidentally or took their own lives. But now, we have to talk about the initial batch of smiley face cases that really took this theory into the mainstream in the Midwestern state of Minnesota. On the evening of April 17, 2009, 24-year-old Jelani Brinson attempted to call his mother, Alice Hamilton, on her cell phone. Alice, who was dining at Mad Jack's Sports Cafe in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, didn't hear the call over the noise of the bustling restaurant, and Jelani, after calling his mother, didn't leave her a voicemail. That same night, Jelani Brinson disappeared. In an eerie coincidence, 3 of Jelani's friends were also at Mad Jack's that evening, that local restaurant, and they believe that Jelani likely made the call to his mother from inside the restaurant. They had all been hanging out that night and they had visited that same eatery. Strangely though, despite being in the exact same place at the exact same time, the mother and son never crossed paths. "It's unsettling that we were both there and never saw each other," Alice later said. "As it turns out, those friends may have been the last people to see Jelani alive." After leaving the restaurant Mad Jack's, the group headed to a friend's house on the 600 block of Kennedy Street near the Anoka County Fairgrounds in Anoka, Minnesota, a suburb or town relatively close to Minneapolis. Jelani stayed for only 5 minutes before abruptly leaving without saying goodbye. According to his friends, there was no argument or incident that prompted Jelani's sudden departure. Alice, an emergency room nurse, contacted the police late Saturday afternoon when Jelani failed to show up for work, missed visiting his young daughter, and left his car untouched. "I've been calling his cell phone repeatedly, hoping someone might answer," Alice told reporters, "but it just goes straight to voicemail. I don't know what to think, but I have a bad feeling," she was quoted as saying. And while we were in Anoka, we actually visited this very street that Jelani disappeared from. Let's take a look.
It was here on the 600 block of Kennedy Drive here in Anoka, Minnesota, where Jelani Brinson was last seen. Now, Jelani was last seen leaving his friend's house in this area, and at that point, nobody knows exactly what happened to him. His scent was followed by dogs all the way along some railroad tracks to an area behind a local bar. It seemed like he had traveled kind of around this area, but his body was eventually discovered in a pond on a golf course, just right over there actually, maybe a few hundred, 1,000 feet away from where he disappeared. But it's strange, articles of his clothing were discovered in this area behind a neighbor's house by a wooden fence, and still, nobody knows exactly what happened to Jelani. When you're here, this looks like your average, everyday neighborhood. I mean, that's because that's what this is. This is a house that almost anybody could live in. I'm sure people at home who are watching this video live in neighborhoods that look strikingly similar to this one. But tragedy, violence, and darkness can strike anywhere. And we're gonna follow Jelani's trail, or not really his trail, but the route that the killer had to have taken to where his body was discovered just a short while later. It's weird. It's very strange. It seems very normal.
Now, authorities considered the possibility that Jelani might have hopped onto a slow-moving train in the area. That's because they tracked some of his clothing and his scent onto some train tracks that were nearby, but Alice dismissed this idea as being completely out of character. She insisted that Jelani never would have left without informing someone or failing to return her calls. "If I call, he always calls back," she said. "Even if I don't leave a message, he'll see my number and return the call." Dina Anderson, Jelani's girlfriend and the mother of his 9-month-old daughter Zion, echoed Alice's concerns. She emphasized at the time of his disappearance that Jelani had never failed to care for their daughter and always kept her informed if plans changed. Both women agreed that his behavior on the night that he disappeared was highly unusual. Law enforcement officials noted that Jelani had no criminal record and found no initial evidence suggesting drugs or alcohol played a role in his disappearance. "We're trying to untangle the relationships between him and the people he interacted with, as well as their possible motives," Police Chief Phil Johansson stated. On Sunday, April 19th, Alice and dozens of volunteers joined police and search dogs to look for Jelani. His winter hat and one of his new Adidas sneakers were discovered beyond a neighbor's wooden fence near the railroad tracks, like I said before, just across the street from where he was last seen. The second shoe was later located in an industrial area south of the tracks near Highway 10 and St. Francis Boulevard. Search dogs tracked Jelani's scent from the friend's house on Kennedy Street to a location approximately 1.5 miles west. The trail ended approximately 100 yards behind a local place named the Outpost Bar. The family reviewed security footage from the bar, but found no sign of Jelani. According to the police chief, the following afternoon, rescue crews began searching the Rum River and surrounding areas in Anoka. And on Saturday, April 25, 2009, at approximately 1 p.m., an employee at Greenhaven Golf Course in Anoka discovered Jelani's body floating in a shallow pond. There were no visible injuries or signs of trauma. The pond was located about 1,500 feet from the house on Kennedy Street, across the road and beyond the railroad tracks. Jelani's body was shoeless, yet his socks were clean, leading investigators to believe that he hadn't walked into the pond himself, but had been placed there. You have to understand, to get to the pond, there's a ton of grass in between the road and the pond, so it would be physically impossible for somebody to walk all the way there without shoes on and have no dirt or anything on their socks. You're going to see in the footage in a moment. The Anoka County Medical Examiner's Office performed an autopsy but could not determine the cause of Jelani's death. The examination revealed no injuries, no signs of foul play, and no traces of drugs or alcohol in Jelani's system. They also ruled out natural causes such as a heart attack or aneurysm, as well as drowning, weirdly enough. The autopsy concluded that Jelani had died prior to being placed in the water. Now, Jelani's wallet was found on his body, seemingly eliminating robbery as a motive. Investigators admitted that they had a few leads. There were no signs of a struggle where his shoe and hat were found, said Sheriff's Lieutenant Paul Summer. His friends had been fully cooperative, but the coroner couldn't establish a cause of death. That makes this case incredibly challenging. Normally, in cases like this, you expect some answers. If he's in a pond, you'd assume he drowned, but he didn't. If he was placed there, you'd expect to find evidence of an injury or overdose. None of that is present here. We're left with very little to go on. Still, to this day, there are no answers in Jelani Brinson's death. We're going to talk about Jelani and his relationship with the Smiley Face Killers, but first, let's take a trip to that pond where Jelani's body was recovered ourselves.
There's the train, actually. So it was right here on those train tracks where the dogs were picking up a scent and where an article of his clothing was found. But right over here, now we drove what, 2 minutes from that last spot?
Mm-hmm.
Right behind us is probably the most infamous place in the tale of Jelani, right over here. So right here, this is where Jelani's body was recovered after he went missing, in this pond here in Anoka, Minnesota. Now, it is interesting because just like we saw with the Austin drownings documentary that we did, there were a lot of inconsistencies with what happened here, how he got into the water. There was no scent connecting him over here. He was missing for an extended period of time. He fit the exact profile of these other Smiley Face Killer victims, and he vanished. Jelani just vanished, leaving his friend's house, and at the time of his death, he wasn't on drugs, he wasn't overly intoxicated, but a recurring theme you're going to see here in these victims was the presence of GHB in Jelani's system. We've talked about GHB a lot, I'm sure, in the documentary already, but if we haven't, GHB is a date rape drug. It's a drug that was in the systems of some of the men that drowned in Austin. It's a drug that's present in a lot of the men's systems here with the Smiley Face killings, and it's essentially a drug that would be administered by a wannabe killer to incapacitate their victim before doing whatever they wanted to them, whether that's torture, sexual assault if that were present, and obviously murder. But right here where he's found floating, and to this day, no one has any answers. Like, how did he get here? Who put him here? What happened? He wasn't suicidal, he wasn't wanting to take his life or anything. A man goes missing and is found floating in a lake. One time, that's weird. Hundreds of times in the same geographical areas with the same MOs and victim profiles and smiley face graffiti. That's not a coincidence. Weird, right?
Yeah, it just looks
very strange.
Yeah, very strange. And it just looks like a beautiful golf course or lake.
Well, I mean, it's also scary. I mean, I've said we did the Austin serial killer documentary, and my doctor believes that when I was drugged, it was GHB too. So, I mean, I understand the experience, and it's scary.
Very scary. You never know. Where are you safe? It's scary.
And once again, all these victims, people sometimes fail to forget this guy was somebody's son, and he was a father too.
Awful.
So he left a void with his parents and with his own child.
I miss him. Don't you miss him? Yeah.
Elise Hamilton visits the cemetery every week to talk to her son.
Hello, Jelani. Zion and I are here to spend some time with you.
And 10 years later, she's still making him the same promise.
I tell him we're going to find out what happened to you, and even if we don't, we love you. You're always with us. That's what I tell him every time.
Jelani Brinson died in 2009, but the exact date and many other details of his death remain elusive. That April, detectives pulled his body from this pond on Greenhaven Golf Course. It was a tragic ending of an 8-day search and the painful beginning of a 10-year mystery.
There's got to be someone out there that knows what happened.
Detective Maggie Titus recently took over the investigation.
This bigger pile is actually statements and reports that I still am going through. What happened in this 1,516-foot area? What happened to Jelani?
Photos shared publicly with KARE 11 for the first time show Jelani's shoes, which were found strewn along a bizarre path that had cut across railroad tracks and a construction site.
Was he being chased? Was he scared of something? His death to me is very suspicious.
The autopsy only deepened the mystery. Coroner ruled out drugs and alcohol as factors, and though they found him in the water, even the cause of death remains undetermined.
As far as I know, he did not drown. We don't even really know what happened, but we know he didn't end up in the pond by himself.
I'm investigating it as a homicide until I find out differently.
I'm just hoping that our family can get peace and justice.
Justice for his daughter Zion.
We love you and we hope you have a great time in heaven.
She just turned 11 and has a 9-year-old brother her dad never got to meet.
I miss you a lot, and so does my little brother Jelani and my mom.
So they'll continue to pray.
I feel like he's here right now.
And keep their promise.
And I always say, Jelani, I'll see you next Sunday.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Chris Jenkins, a 21-year-old University of Minnesota business student, was admired for his wit and charisma. A dedicated athlete, he captained the school's lacrosse team and grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, with his parents Steve and Jan and his sister Sarah. Jan recalls that Chris's humor was what people cherished the most about him. Chris, like many future victims of the Smiley Face Killers, was a popular athletic young man, right on the verge of becoming something great. Growing into adulthood can be a challenging time in your life, but Chris's future seemed to be lining up in the stars. That is, until Halloween night in the year 2002. On October 31st, 2002, Chris dressed up as a Native American and attended a Halloween party at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in Minneapolis. That night was to be his first night spent celebrating Halloween as a legal adult. He was 21 years old and he was ready to drink. That evening, Chris attended the party with his girlfriend at the time, a girl named Ashley Rice, and a small group of friends. Before the group had gone out to the Lone Tree Bar and Grill that evening, they had spent some time drinking beer out of a keg at Chris's home, and shortly afterwards, the group had headed out for the Lone Tree Bar and Grill. After arriving at the nightclub, the group continued to drink and enjoy the night, and for a while, everything seemed to be going well. There was dancing, there was drinking, and everyone seemed to be reveling in the spooky vibes of Halloween night. However, at around midnight, a dark sequence of events were put into motion. On that evening, at around midnight, Chris was kicked out of the Lone Tree Bar under unclear circumstances. While the exact reason he was kicked out of the bar remains unknown, it's believed that he was heavily intoxicated at the time, and sadly, this removal marked the last time that Chris was seen alive. When Chris failed to return home later that evening, his friends and family began to grow concerned. He wasn't answering phone calls, nobody had seen him, and there seemed to be no trace of Chris anywhere in the city of Minneapolis. It was almost as if he had just vanished into thin air. As hours turned to days and days turned to weeks, Chris's friends and family knew that something was wrong. The police had used bloodhounds and picked up a scent that led to nowhere. There had been sightings of Chris, reported to the authorities, but still, no one had any idea where he was. 4 months later, on February 27th, 2003, Chris's body was recovered from the Mississippi River, wedged between logs near the area between the 3rd Avenue Bridge and St. Anthony Falls. Initial reports at the time suggested that Chris's death was likely nothing more than a tragic accident, and some even suggested that Chris may have ended his own life. Investigators who were working this case at the time also hinted that an argument between Chris and his girlfriend on the evening that he went missing might have played a role in his actions that evening. In news outlets and on television, it was speculated that Chris had either wandered into the river while lost in thought, or had intentionally ended his own life after that argument. This detail about the argument between Chris and his girlfriend that occurred on the night that he went missing has led most people who studied this case to believe that Chris's ejection from the bar may have stemmed from this argument. And obviously, if he was drunk, that probably didn't help. I can assume that tempers had been flared, angry words had been shared, and that both Chris and his girlfriend had decided that after Chris had been kicked out of the bar, they needed a temporary break from each other. And this argument between the couple was considered by local authorities to have been so intense that it probably contributed to Chris's presumed state of mind that evening. Authorities in this case were quick to try plant their own clues or interpretations of evidence. Chris was troubled that night, they said. Chris was sad and angry, drunk and alone, in a not so good situation, they also said. But at the time, these details were possibly withheld to protect the reputations of those involved, mainly Chris's girlfriend and her family, and to avoid implicating Chris's girlfriend or any of his friends in a crime that they weren't suspected of committing. Witnesses that were there at the Lone Tree Bar that evening also later stated that they heard the staff of the bar talking amongst themselves after they were informed by management not to let Chris back in, even though the weather outside was a chilly 20 degrees and continuing to drop rapidly. On that night, Chris walked out of the bar and into the darkness. Inside of the bar, he left his coat, wallet, cell phone, and keys with his friends. It's unknown still to this day where Chris was walking to, but according to the bouncer that was working that night, he saw Chris leave the bar and watched as he took a left on foot onto nearby Hennepin Avenue. Chris's frame of mind on the night that he disappeared paints a poignant picture. He was a young adult, heavily inebriated, embarrassed from being removed from the bar, and emotionally distraught following a heated argument. Combined, these factors likely left him vulnerable, but had he been vulnerable to himself or vulnerable prey for a syndicate of serial killers? After that argument and his disappearance, as I said before, for a couple months, Chris wasn't seen again, and eventually, when his body was recovered from the Mississippi River, it was located in somewhat close proximity to the bar where he was last seen. Eerily, when Chris's body was pulled out of the icy river water, he was still dressed in the same Halloween costume, a Native American outfit that he had worn out that evening. To this day, little additional information has been disclosed about the exact condition of his body, but apparently there were no extreme signs of physical trauma or evidence suggesting foul play. Those are secrets that the local authorities still hold closely to their chests. Upon the discovery of Chris's remains, his family faced an agonizing wait for toxicology results, a delay that isn't uncommon in such cases. Obviously, the authorities wanted to know just how drunk Chris had been, and needed some clues in order to determine exactly when and how he had ended up in that frozen river. And when those reports were finalized, according to the autopsy technicians, they indicated that Chris's blood alcohol concentration was significantly above the legal threshold. According to authorities, Chris had been drunk on the night that he died. And so, based on this finding, authorities concluded that Chris's death resulted from drowning, likely due to either an accidental fall or a suicide. Publicly, their statements leaned towards the belief that Chris may have taken his own life, but at that point in time, there was absolutely zero stock put into the notion that Chris may have been murdered. Just take a look at some of the reporting at the time, both on television and in newspapers. The authorities were trying to go really hard with the accident or scenario. Either they didn't want to believe that it was possible that Chris had been murdered, or they'd been too lazy to take the time to actually investigate. What sets Chris's case apart, though, is that although his death was initially classified as an accidental drowning or it was later determined to have been a homicide. Yes, the authorities in Minneapolis at first stuck with their theory that this was some sort of accident and only presented evidence to the public which confirmed their bias, but they also failed to include and release evidence that definitely made it look like Chris had been murdered. And this was a pretty shocking move. You don't see police departments going back and changing causes of death from accidental to murder very often. And in addition, adding to the rarity of this decision, after this change, the Minneapolis Police Department issued a public apology to Chris's family, and they publicly acknowledged the errors in their investigation. While Chris's parents, Jan and Steve Jenkins, were determined to uncover the truth, law enforcement agencies rarely alter the official cause of death, even under significant public scrutiny. An official apology is even more unusual, highlighting the complexity of Chris's case and murder. But just what happened and what prompted the police to reclassify Chris Jenkins' death as a murder? Even after 2 decades, much remains unknown. Authorities have kept significant details under wraps, likely to protect sensitive information that only the perpetrator would know in the event of a confession. However, by withholding key information, investigators have unintentionally stifled broader public interest and awareness of the case. Today, we'll examine a few of these known facts surrounding Chris's death and the discovery of his body to better understand what might have happened that night. Chris's parents, Jan and Steve Jenkins, had known from the very beginning that their son hadn't died in a tragic accident, and they also knew that he hadn't taken his own life. And so, unwilling to accept the police's conclusions, they embarked on their own investigation. They sought answers through various means, by hiring private detectives and consulting experts in hydrology, and their pursuit to uncover the truth also ventured into unconventional territory, including consultations with psychics who revealed to the family some pretty insane evidence and embracing some conspiracy theories, such as claims of a satanic cult's involvement in Chris's death. Through their investigation, they discovered that the condition of Chris's body was inconsistent with the police's assertions of an accident or suicide. Typically, drowning victims are recovered lying face down, with their arms extended outward, their clothing in disarray, often missing one or both shoes. This is because the natural instinct during a drowning involves frantic movements of the arms and legs in an effort to stay afloat. In contrast, Chris's body was recovered lying on his back, with his arms perfectly crossed like this over his chest. His shirt remained neatly tucked into his drawstring pants, and he was still wearing both oversized slip-on shoes. Additionally, he was still adorned with a necklace, as well as a ring on his left index finger and another on his right ring finger. These details raise serious doubts about the theories of accidental drowning or self-harm proposed by law enforcement. A particularly notable observation from Chris's parents that still troubles most people who examine this evidence concerns the condition of Chris's body when it was found in the water. Despite allegedly having jumped off of the bridge or having fallen into the river, Chris's costume remained fully intact, with his shirt, like I said, still tucked in and his slip-on shoes securely on his feet. If Chris had actually fallen into the river and been forced to swim for his life before drowning, his clothing wouldn't have been in such perfect condition, and his shoes definitely wouldn't have been on his feet. Additionally, when Chris was found in the river, like I said before, his arms were crossed over on his chest, like this, a detail that has raised significant questions about the circumstances of his death. I mean, it's clear with a detail like that there was some premeditation here. Somebody had killed Chris, put his body in the water, and had essentially posed his body to send some sort of a message. Both Kevin and Anthony independently corroborated this information for me, as they've both taken extensive looks at the crime scene photos and both agree that his arms were found unnaturally crossed on the day that his body was found. Chris's family also found it peculiar that there were no visible bruises on Chris's body, especially considering that he was, at the time of his death, a lacrosse goalie who frequently sustained bruises on his legs and arms. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Chris had participated in 2 games and attended practice, activities that usually left marks, scrapes, and bruises on his body. The absence of these bruises led his parents to suspect that he may have been alive for several days after vanishing, possibly being held hostage, giving his body enough time to heal. Experts in river hydrology who examine the Mississippi River have also expressed doubts that Chris's body could have remained in the water for 4 months without being noticed. The river had not frozen over until January of 2003, over 2 months after Chris's initial disappearance, and the area beneath the 3rd Avenue Bridge was thoroughly searched in the weeks after he went missing. On February 27th, the day Chris's body was discovered, there was a daytime thaw, which may have caused his body to drift from a different location before becoming lodged in the tree branches where it was eventually found. This has led many individuals, including Chris's family members, to believe that Chris was actually kidnapped and held captive for an indefinite amount of time before he was ultimately murdered and placed in the river by his killer or killers. In addition, it was allegedly, according to some reports, discovered that Chris was holding on to a clump of human hair in his left hand. According to these reports, it's believed that investigators themselves believe that this was Chris's own hair. Jan and Steve's investigations into their son's murder produced a number of interesting leads. One potential lead suggested that Chris might have been seen heading north on the Hennepin Avenue Bridge spanning the Mississippi River on the night he went missing. This information was apparently told to authorities by an eyewitness who claimed that they had seen a man that looked similar to Chris walking across the bridge that evening. However, eventually, the Jenkins family managed to secure access to surveillance footage of the bridge for analysis, and what they saw was concerning. There were 2 security cameras installed at the Federal Reserve Bank, both aimed at the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, Jan Jenkins explained to an interviewer. Given that this was post 9/11, the equipment was state-of-the-art. We have written confirmation from the supervisor indicating that multiple people reviewed the footage from both cameras, covering late October 31st and the early hours of November 1st. Chris does not appear in the footage. We do not believe he crossed that bridge. The supervisor even informed the FBI that it would be nearly impossible for someone to run across the bridge without being captured on camera. That's a direct quote from Jan Jenkins. In their quest for answers, the Jenkins family hired private investigator Chuck Loesch, who uncovered witness accounts of a violent encounter near Times Square Pizza, a pizza restaurant located literally across the street from the Lone Tree Bar. According to these witnesses, a group of at least 10 individuals on the night that Chris had gone missing had attacked a man in what was believed to be a sort of gang initiation. It was a violent assault, during which this group of men beat on and assaulted a single man who had been walking down the street. This statement was corroborated by multiple witnesses, so it really does seem like this fight or beatdown did happen, and Times Square Pizza was located very close to the Lone Tree Bar. However, to this day, the exact timing of the incident remains unclear, but it may have occurred around the same time that Chris exited the bar. In addition to this lead, the Jenkins family independently employed 2 separate bloodhound teams with different handlers to attempt to trace Chris's scent. Interestingly, both dogs picked up Chris's scent on the sidewalk right outside of the pizza restaurant where the alleged altercation took place. And remarkably, both sets of dogs completely independently followed that same scent into the adjacent parking garage and stopped at the same parking stall. When the Jenkins family and their private investigator took a closer look at the parking spot and the specific area that both sets of bloodhounds had traced Chris's scent to, they found what looked like bloodstains and a red feather, potentially from Chris's Native American costume, inside the parking structure and in that immediate area. These discoveries added weight to the theory that Chris's disappearance and death were the result of foul play rather than an accident, but none of that evidence, even though it does exist, has ever been formally explained. We actually visited the former location of the One Tree Bar and Grill, the parking garage where Chris's scent was tracked to, and the area of the Times Square Pizza while we were in Minneapolis. Take a look.
So on the night that Chris disappeared, the last known location of his was at the One Tree Bar, which literally was just right around the corner. Right now we're in downtown Minneapolis, and I don't know if we're gonna get copyrighted for the music, so you can just come around and take a look. But it's right here, the Gold Room. I can't talk now. So Chris was seen right there at that Lone Tree Bar, and what ended up happening is obviously he disappeared and he was never heard from or seen again until his body was recovered from the river nearby. But what's interesting is that Chris's family members actually hassled the police and local authorities and eventually were able to hire a team that came out with scent sniffing dogs. They tracked Chris's scent right at the Lone Tree Bar, and if you come down here, you gotta imagine this was back in 2002, so that was over 20 years ago. This area looked a lot different, but these scent dogs followed Chris's scent all the way down the street here to 521 Hennepin Avenue, which we're right here right now. There used to be a pizza shop in this area called Times Square Pizza and Pub, and that's where the dogs identified that Chris had walked from the bar to this area. Now, a different witness that evening actually reported seeing a group of 5 to 10 men assaulting a man outside of that same pizza shop. It was never identified who those people were, who that man was that they were assaulting, but someone did call in and report that on Halloween night they did witness that stuff. But the most intriguing part of all is that this area, I don't know what this looks like, but this is a parking garage and area. But the scent dogs actually followed Chris's scent underground to an underground parking structure to the parking spot of an actual employee of the One Tree Bar. Now, investigators found something that looked like fabric samples, blood drippings, blood drops. There was some evidence in that area. I don't know if it was ever properly investigated or analyzed. I don't believe that it was. But how weird is that? The river's that way. Chris's scent comes over here outside of the pizza shop where a group of men are seen beating a man, and then down into a parking lot to the exact stall that an employee of the bar that he was kicked out of parked at every day. It was his reserved spot. I mean, it's really fucking weird, man. And that's just another strange red herring in all of these stories. Where does that go? Where does this lead? What does that point to? I don't know. It is weird though, right? It was right here. What the fuck happened to Chris? All right.
Now, there were also a few interesting leads that private investigator Chuck Loesch dug up when concerning the Lone Tree Bar and Grill itself. For example, when Chuck interviewed employees at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, They consistently explained that Chris exited the establishment on his own and refuted the testimony of others who claimed they had witnessed Chris get kicked out. However, after more questions from Chuck, the investigator, the bar's owner eventually imposed a strict gag order, instructing staff not to speak with anyone about the incident unless accompanied by legal representation. Chuck also discovered that a man named Mike Casey, an off-duty law enforcement officer, was reportedly at the bar on Halloween night. He had been working security for the neighboring Hennepin Center for the Arts and was introduced to Chris by Ashley, Chris's girlfriend, who was at the time a bar employee. Ashley was allegedly familiar with Mike Casey, having borrowed his own uniform shirt to complete her sexy police officer costume. Allegedly, Casey requested that the security supervisor escort Chris out of the bar, openly flirted with Ashley throughout the evening, and even drove her home after the bar had closed. Despite these claims, the Minneapolis Police Department never officially interrogated Casey or even questioned him, and when asked about their decision not to investigate this lead, they stated, quote, "He's a married man with children. We don't want to disrupt a family," end quote. It was also discovered, according to some reports, that GHB, a sedative often associated with drug-facilitated crimes, was found in Chris's system after his body was recovered. And this is going to be a big recurring theme throughout these crimes. Why GHB though? Well, GHB is a party drug of sorts, and it's also known as the date drug. It comes in many forms, but it most commonly comes as a sort of clear liquid. GHB is a popular drug amongst criminals because with just a small amount of it, they can render a person almost unconscious. For years, predators have been drugging their victims with GHB in order to knock them out so that they could assault them, hence its nickname, the date drug. It's commonly known that GHB is an incredibly potent substance that can put the person who takes it into an almost comatose state, where they have no control over their bodily functions and no memory afterwards. In fact, on the website betterhealth.vic.gov, the effects of GHB are listed as being relaxation, drowsiness, sociability, euphoria, lack of inhibition, increased sex drive, heightened sensitivity to touch, dizziness, vomiting, tremors, tunnel vision, loss of coordination, confusion, irritation and agitation, hallucinations, blackouts and memory lapses, seizures, coma, respiratory arrest, and death. So as you can see, it's a horrifically powerful drug that, if administered to an unwilling party, could render someone completely defenseless. It's believed that the smiley face killers are fond of using this drug to knock out their victims, and I've recently covered a story eerily similar to this one. In the last few years in Austin, Texas, over 25 young men have been murdered, and it's suspected that they were administered doses of GHB before they were abducted and then killed. Just like in the case of Chris Jenkins, these men in Austin have been going missing after a night spent drinking in downtown Austin, and they're then found a day or a few days later in Lady Bird Lake. And it's commonly believed in the Austin cases that some, if not all of the victims, are being administered doses of GHB immediately before their disappearances. But back to Chris. Interestingly, Chris wasn't the only one who had allegedly been drugged while drinking at the Lone Tree Bar. In fact, after Chris vanished, another individual came forward and testified that he had visited the same bar months earlier, and that he had reportedly fallen ill after consuming a single drink that was served to him there. According to this victim, after being brought to the hospital, it was found that he had high levels of GHB in his system. GHB that he was convinced had been served to him in a spiked drink at the Lone Tree Bar. In a strange twist, in 2005, an imprisoned man who was at the time incarcerated in the Minnesota prison system confessed to witnessing Chris's death and claimed on the record that it had allegedly occurred during a botched mugging. According to the prisoner's account, Chris was targeted but had no valuables on him due to his costume's lack of pockets. This enraged the man's accomplice, who then allegedly pushed Chris over a bridge. Eventually, like I mentioned before, the authorities in Minneapolis changed their ruling on Chris's death, stating that he had actually been murdered. The statement from the Minneapolis police chief at the time, a man named Tim Dolan, went as follows: "We made an assumption, and because of that assumption, we probably caused pain. Well, I know we caused pain. In the Jenkins family. More pain than they had to suffer, and than they already suffered. And for that, for the Minneapolis Police Department, I want to apologize to the Jenkins family." End quote. In 2007, authorities in Minneapolis, after gathering some evidence, presented a suspect to the county attorney, but no charges were filed due to insufficient evidence. And there have been no real developments since. The real killer or killers who ended Chris's life are still wandering out there amongst the public, free as a bird. But this story gets weirder. Chris wasn't the only young athletic male to have gone missing after drinking at a local bar, who ended up dead in a nearby body of water that fall/winter. You see, just a few days after Chris went missing, on November 6, 2002, Michael Knoll, a 22-year-old University of Wisconsin student, disappeared after celebrating his birthday in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Shortly after, on November 9th, Josh Gumand, a 20-year-old student from Collegeville, Minnesota, went missing after leaving a gathering of friends. These three young men vanished within a 100-mile radius of Minneapolis, sharing similar physical traits, ages, and circumstances. On the nights of their disappearances, they had attended nighttime parties or gatherings located near bodies of water, and they had all disappeared after spending the night drinking. And still, there are no explanations in the deaths of any of these three men.
So, you have this young man who is found in the river. There's some weird inconsistencies with the case. Nobody wants to look at this thing as a murder. Obviously, I've seen this in Austin, even with my friend who was beaten almost to death and found on the side of the river. It's always an accident. How did it go for you guys from this one case to, constructing this whole theory? What was the next step?
The next step was he was doing research, and we discovered the Chris Jenkins case in Minneapolis. And that case has glaring inconsistencies in that case with their supposed events from that night. He went missing it was October 31st, so it was Halloween. He went to a party at a local bar there in Minneapolis, and then they claimed that he came out and he was all stumbly, which he was, but not because he was drunk, because we feel he was drugged. Walked across the bridge and fell off the bridge into the river. Now, that right there, we proved that was wrong. There's no way that happened, because there's a Federal Reserve Bank right there on one side of the bridge that has cameras. We viewed the cameras. He's not seen ever crossing that bridge. And he was found months later, stuck in some river debris with the level of GHB that was found in his system. There's no way that it all happened.
Why do you think Minneapolis was kind of a hub? Because you had Chris Jenkins, Jelani Brinson. I can't recall if there were more victims there, but it seems like that was kind of like a point they were at with the other people too.
We had interviewed a guy in prison, and in court documents, because he's now in prison for life, because he got convicted of a homicide in another city nearby, Minneapolis. There was a group called the Dealers of Death, and they would go out and pick their victims, sometimes for fun, sometimes in a weird way for rewards or an initiation. And that was in and around Minneapolis at that time.
So it was like a loosely knit kind of group of murderers?
Well, there were two main leaders, and pretty much these kids were wayward kids that they went to a community center, and that's how they met these kids. They met them, recruited them, and they offered them in a weird way like a family. These kids were loners and on the edge of, in the fringe of, in trouble, and that's how they recruited them. And again, it's in court documents that one of the witnesses, who was part of the group, admitted to how many members are in it. Not to say that he admitted to killing a lot of people, but based on the information that we got, they were a whole part of it, and that was in the Minneapolis area.
So do you think they're responsible for both Jelani and Chris Jenkins?
I'm not sure about Jelani, if it's them directly, but them and the ideology that they believe in, I believe that was part of it for Jelani. And there were two different guys that helped run the group, and the two different leaders had two separate ideologies with the same main goal of getting a victim. And it has to do with particular dates and signs. And one of the recurring signs we found was a smiley face. And that's not the most prominent one, but however, when we first brought it forward, the press got a hold of it, and they blew it up, the Smiley Face Killers. So that's just one of the different graffitis that we found.
And I want you to consider the similarities. Jelani Brinson leaves his house, no one knows where he's going. The dogs pick up his scent, they find pieces of his clothing, and somehow, inexplicably, days later, he's discovered in a body of water. And remember, in Jelani's case, His socks were completely clean, so the authorities said it looked like he was placed there. Then you have Chris Jenkins from a few years before that, who disappeared under very similar circumstances. Nobody knew where he went. The scent dogs tracked him to a weird location. There was a bar connection, and he ended up in a body of water as well. Authorities also said it looked like he had been placed in there versus drowned. So leaving Minnesota after that night, I knew that something still wasn't right. We still weren't done here. There's still so much left unsaid, so many leads still left uninvestigated, so many pieces of evidence in these drowning deaths with no good practical explanation. And so we decided to wait another month, then pick it up and head to Lacrosse, Wisconsin, where Kevin and Tony have gathered some of the clearest evidence of the existence of the Smiley Face Killer cult to date. In Lacrosse, Wisconsin, over the past almost 30 years since 1997, there have been 11 young men who have drowned or died under suspicious circumstances, whose bodies have been discovered in the nearby Mississippi and Black Rivers. The first drowning was that of 19-year-old Richard Hlavity, who, when visiting his brother James in Lacrosse, was chased with his brother to the river from the corner of 3rd and Pearl Street in town by a group of attackers. James escaped the ordeal, but sadly, Richard did not. His body was then found in the water shortly afterwards, and the attackers were never identified. Then, in that same year, there was Charles Blatz, a 28-year-old UW Platteville student who was visiting Lacrosse for Oktoberfest celebrations. He was last seen headed downtown to hit the bars before he vanished. 5 days later, he was found floating in the river with a BAC of 0.31%. Next, during that same year of 1997, it was 19-year-old Tony Skifton who died. Tony disappeared after leaving a party at 525th Avenue on October 5th, 1997, and was last seen walking near a footbridge at a local park. His body was found 5 days later in the river with a BAC of 0.23%. We actually visited the location where Tony's body was found. Take a look.
You see that person that was over there right when we pulled up? There's a car parked right there, right when we pulled up. You can see their lights over there if you film it. Oh, this is eerie, man. It is. So when the water's right beneath me right now, this is where the body of Tony Skifton was found. Tony went missing in October of 1997 after leaving a party way far away from this location, and he was found days later in the river. Now, Tony fit the victim profile perfectly. He was, an attractive young male in really good shape. He had a promising career ahead of him. He was getting an education, and he once again vanished and then was found days later with no explanation really being given for what happened in those days that he remained missing for. But this is just another area here in Lacrosse. The whole city is painted with these sorts of locations where bodies have been found, where men have gone missing from. And there is an eeriness definitely to this area. It's an unspoken eeriness that soaks into the environment. Just looking, it's creepy. Just come over here, let's just show this. Let's say you're a mass killer, right? You're a member of a serial killing club or group that wants to dispose of a body. It's 9:00 p.m. right now on a Friday in January when a lot of these cases, have happened. Look at this. This park is completely empty. It's completely desolate. I mean, it really is the perfect place for a crime. Imagine going over there, parking down there, even parking right here and coming and just dumping the body in. Or right here, throw him in, he washes over here. It'd be pretty easy. I know, man. It's just weird, right?
I even think about, you come out here when, the lake and the river is, a little bit more frozen. You can walk out even further.
Yeah.
I wonder how many... It's also crazy to think, because in Minneapolis, the ones are right next to a big bridge like this, too.
Yeah. They want people to think they jumped or were pushed over.
But I'm like, who's jumping off a bridge?
All these young men.
Yeah, coincidence.
Well, we got one more place to go. I think his body was found right down there. Yeah. Yeah. hard to imagine.
The next young man to be found in Lacrosse's waterways was 20-year-old Nathan Kapfer, who disappeared just a few months after Tony on February 18, 1998. Nathan was, once again, a university student and was last seen walking alone on 3rd Street, a local street filled with bars, after being cited for underage drinking outside of a local watering hole named Brothers Bar. Now, in a bizarre twist, after Nathan went missing, his hat, wallet, and police citations were all found neatly arranged near a statue depicting an indigenous person in nearby Riverside Park. His items had been arranged in a way that, to authorities and family members alike, seemed incredibly ritualistic and premeditated. Nathan's body was found in the river near Riverside Park in April of '98, months after he went missing. He had a BAC of 0.22% at the time of his death. Almost a year after Nathan's body was found, a 20-year-old University of Wisconsin lacrosse student named Jeffrey Giese went missing after last being seen alive at a bar on, once again, 3rd Street in downtown Lacrosse. A month later, in May, his body was recovered from the Mississippi River, and he was found to have had a BAC of 0.42% at his time of death. Around March 1st or 2nd of 2001, 23-year-old Patrick Runningen drowned in the Black River in Lacrosse, after having last been seen in the parking lot of Nutbush City Limits, a local bar and grill. His body was found later, once again, in the river. He had a BAC of 0.24% at his time of death. A few years later, in 2004, came one of the most infamous of all of the Lacrosse drownings, that of Jared Dion. After an evening spent drinking and dancing early on April 10, 2004, Jared was last seen by a friend boarding the Safe Ride bus, a free shuttle service that transports students between the University of Wisconsin Lacrosse campus and downtown. It was closing time at John's Bar, and most of Jared's friends had already left. Jared, however, mentioned to his friend Mark Hoagland that he wanted one more drink. Mark insisted otherwise, urging Jared to leave with him so they wouldn't miss the final bus home. Believing Jared was following him, Mark walked away. But when he turned around, Jared was no longer there. Jared was known for being dependable, responsible, and an excellent student on track to graduate. People in town knew him as an honors student, and Jared enjoyed being social. Wandering off without informing anyone was entirely out of character. Later that day, Jared's mother realized that he had never returned home after going out that night. Concerned after not hearing from her son, Jared's mother filed a missing persons report on Saturday evening, as she had been trying to contact him to finalize Easter plans. 5 days later, Jared's body was recovered by divers in the Mississippi River. A group of joggers in Riverside Park discovered his hat nearby, carefully perched on a post near the area where authorities believe Jared may have fallen or entered the water. Dr. Lindsay Thomas of the Minnesota Regional Coroner's Office conducted the autopsy and determined the cause of death to be cold water drowning. Interestingly, this would be the second time that a victim's clothing or personal items would be found in Riverside Park. This had happened in the past with Nathan Kapfer, whose wallet, hat, and police citations were found in Riverside Park, near the indigenous person statue we discussed before his body was found. The same had been true with Jared Dion. At this point, rumors of a serial killer were running rampant in Lacrosse, and tensions were boiling to a frenzy point. In fact, local authorities believed that these rumors were so unfounded and so damaging at the time that a group of faculty members from the University of Wisconsin Lacrosse actually penned an open letter to the student body and the city titled, "Why We Are 99.9% Sure It Is Not a Serial Killer," in which they provided data and evidence that they claimed pointed towards the non-existence of a serial killer or killers in Lacrosse. But unfortunately, the bodies would continue to wash up in the river. 2 years later, 21-year-old Luke Homan, a member of the University of Wisconsin lacrosse basketball team, would disappear in the early morning hours of September 30th, 2006, after a night of drinking at several downtown bars, once again, near 3rd Street. On September 30th, 2006, Luke Homan joined his friends to celebrate Oktoberfest in downtown Lacrosse. He was last seen around 2:15 a.m. at The Vibe Bar, located at 322 J Street, early that Saturday morning. Concerns arose when his roommates contacted police later that day after Luke failed to show up for a planned golf outing. What followed was a harrowing weekend for his loved ones as they searched desperately for any trace of Luke. But on Monday of that following week, their worst fears were realized. Luke had drowned. On October 2nd, Luke's body was discovered submerged in 10 feet of water near a levee along the Mississippi River, close to the southern end of Riverside Park. Dr. Lindsay Thomas, who conducted the autopsy, reportedly found no evidence of trauma, struggle, or foul play. The report confirmed that Luke's blood alcohol concentration was 0.32, leading authorities to conclude that his death was an accidental drowning. Luke was a talented athlete with an impressive high school basketball record at Brookfield Central, where he helped his team reach the state tournament twice during his 3 varsity years. He even set a school record with 165 three-point shots and made 16 free throws in a single game. In college, Luke had joined the UW-Milwaukee basketball team as a walk-on and played 9 games during the 2004-05 season, contributing to the Panthers' Sweet 16 NCAA tournament appearance. So Luke was an incredibly talented athlete. He was in peak physical condition. He didn't have an incredibly high BAC level. And so how does a guy like that end up in the water? Any of these guys drowning when they're obviously physically capable of swimming. That's just one of the things that really sticks out and doesn't make sense. On September 22nd, 2007, the Lacrosse Tribune reported new developments involving Austin Scott, a 19-year-old UW Lacrosse sophomore who had been accused of misleading investigators about the circumstances surrounding Luke's disappearance and drowning. Scott, who was also a member of the basketball team and a friend of Luke's, eventually pleaded no contest to 2 misdemeanor charges of obstructing officers. He was sentenced to 48 hours in Lacrosse County Jail, followed by 1 year of probation. Whether or not he had any involvement in Luke's death, we don't know, and we may never know, Lacrosse County District Attorney Tim Grunke said at the time, but his lies obstructed the investigation and created lingering doubts that will likely never be resolved, end quote. Like we said before, Luke's body had been recovered on October 2nd. The autopsy attributed his death to cold water drowning. Friends last saw Luke at the Vibe Bar around 9 or 10 p.m. on September 29th, but Scott, the man who was put in jail, told police he saw Luke leave the bar alone around 12:30 a.m. on September 30th. However, according to the criminal complaint, Scott had been cited for underage drinking near the Radisson Hotel around 10 p.m. that evening, and he had been found to have a BAC of 0.33%. Grunke noted a troubling pattern in Scott's statements. The number of falsehoods he told all seemed to point in the same direction, keeping investigators from knowing he was in Riverside Park that night. We don't know why he lied, and that remains a mystery, end quote. Scott claimed to have no memory of much of the night, admitting to only remembering fragments of events. He initially told authorities that he recalled sitting at the Vibe Bar and insisted, "I would never leave him in the water." However, he later admitted it was possible he and Luke were in Riverside Park together when Luke fell into the river, theorizing that Luke might have tripped. Scott also confessed to fabricating a story about 3 men arguing with Luke at the Vibe, which sent police on a futile search for non-existent suspects. Defense attorney Mark McCabe argued that Scott's memory gaps stemmed from his intoxication and emphasized that his client admitted to lying about his address, birth date, and journey home that night. However, McCabe maintained that Scott bore no responsibility for Luke's death. This community is understandably frustrated by the 8 separate river deaths that have occurred here, McCabe said, but my client cannot be blamed for those prior tragedies, or for Luke's passing, end quote. Luke's mother, Patty Homan, addressed the court with both heartbreak and compassion. "I truly believe Austin knows more about what happened that night," she said, "but I want him to have a happy, productive life. The only way he'll get there is by telling the truth, even if it's the worst truth, even if he pushed Luke into the water. I'd embrace him and tell him we'd get through it together," end quote. At this point, 8 different young athletic men had drowned in bodies of water in Lacrosse after nights spent out on the town drinking, and it still wouldn't stop anytime soon. The next man found in the water was 24-year-old Christopher B. Mellencamp, a Milwaukee native who fell from the Cass Street Bridge into the Mississippi River at around 1:30 a.m. on September 30th, 2007. His BAC at the time of death was 0.24%, and police to this day have failed to determine whether his death was accidental or Then in 2010, it was 21-year-old Craig Myers, who was found in the icy waters. On Valentine's Day 2010, Craig had been dropped off in the 700 block of Market Street, and video evidence later uncovered showed him walking west on Cass Street in Lacrosse at approximately 2 a.m. Divers later recovered Craig's body from the water and also discovered a series of footprints leading onto the ice, footprints that we're going to talk about in more depth in a moment. Craig's BAC at the time of his death was 0.19%. And finally, on July 8, 2014, 23-year-old Shalim Augustine left his group of friends after they docked their boat near the Black River Beach. Suspicions arose when, the next day, Shalim failed to show up for his work at Huck Finn's restaurant. His body was found 3 days later in the Black River, and it was discovered that at the time of his death, he had a BAC of 0.32%. That's a pretty staggering amount of young men dying in a relatively small city's waterways. In fact, this was such a problem at one point that an organization was founded on the University of Wisconsin La Crosse campus called Riverwatch. which aimed to patrol the Riverside Park and offer students walks or rides home from bars after they had been drinking. To this day, all these incidents are listed or classified as bizarre accidents and nothing more, even though there are patterns, even though there are details that don't line up with the accidents theory, and even though the parents of some of the victims believe that there is much more to the stories. Initially, I noticed a pattern in some of these drownings. A lot of the men seemed to share some similar physical features. A lot of them went missing or were found on or around the same dates. The clothing being placed on poles or stacked and arranged is bizarre, and a number of corpses were discovered in Riverside Park. In addition, a select group of the men all seemed to have been drinking and were last seen in the same part of downtown Lacrosse, near 3rd Street, on the nights that they went missing. And so, naturally, when we first got to town, we had to head to 3rd Street to check out the area for ourselves.
So right now it's a snowy winter's evening in January here in Lacrosse, Wisconsin, and we're here for the second part of our investigation into the Smiley Face Killers. Now, you might be wondering where we're at inside of Lacrosse. We're actually in the 100 block of 3rd Street. So it was in this area that 5 of the total 11 victims that are rumored to be attributed to the Smiley Face Killer. Some people think there's a smaller grouping of victims that could be attributed to the theory. Others think it's all of them. But 5 young men disappeared from this small swath of downtown Lacrosse. They were out drinking late into the night. Some of these men took off walking in this direction up the hill, totally away from the river, and they were found days later dead in the river way down in that direction. Now, you'll notice a similar pattern here in Minneapolis. Once again, it's young men who go missing after a full night of drinking out on the town. These men typically are having just a normal night with their friends. At one point they get separated, maybe they go home early, they start walking, and days later they're found dead in the river, sometimes months later. But it's interesting. Right now it's a Friday night in January. School is in session, the local college is in, and this is what a Friday night would look like here in Lacrosse. Now, one of the victims actually was attacked on January 8th, so 2 days before. It's January 10th right now, and you kind of get a general vibe. Maybe it wasn't as cold one of those nights and there were more people out. I'm sure that as the night, goes on, more people are going to come out to the streets, but just take a look. It's literally bars that obviously a lot of them are closed now. Now let's just take a quick walk. You can see there's bars everywhere here. Crow Bar, John's Bar, that's actually where one of the victims was drinking on the night they disappeared. The Helm Bar. This is the area.
I mean, like, look at the Crow Bar, the huge bar. One table is filled.
Yeah. Now, I didn't expect Lacrosse to really look like this, to be honest. I've never been to Lacrosse, so I would have no real idea. But in a weird way, I almost get an Austin type vibe. You know what I mean? These old buildings and all these bars right here. It's very interesting. The mystery, man. When you really think about it. Like, as you can see right here, this is 113 3rd Street. This would have been where those bars were. 5 young men from this small area dead in the river. It's weird. I just wanted y'all to take this in. It's a snowy night here. Beautiful weather if you like the snow, which I do. I mean, it's just what strikes me always, and I always say this, we always talk about this, how normal it seems. This was what? 2006, the late 90s. So almost 30 years ago, 25 years ago. It's like these places in society just heals and moves on and just forgets about it. You'd never think that 5 young men just drinking right here were killed by a serial killing group.
This shit always blows my mind. I mean, this is just an everyday American town. You got snow falling down, music playing. I mean, it seems like a really cool place to hang out. People don't realize, like, it's streets like this where people are getting scooped up and law enforcement's not really doing anything about it. They'd rather just kind of glaze over the fact that it happens and then move on about the day. But from some of the other stuff that we've looked at, it's connected to multiple other states. Could be connected to thousands of members of this group. It's scary.
It's a lot of f***ing people.
Yeah.
And it's like I said to him during the interview.
It's not like an evil looking creepy guys walking around like, hey, let me abduct and murder you. It's like just everyday people.
Not
people
every everyday guy in a jacket.
No. But really, it's like, you're at a bar, you're talking to some guys. This one guy's really nice. Maybe says, hey, you want a drink? I'll buy you something. Boom, you're dead.
It's not just girls either that this is happening to. I mean, guys are very unsuspecting in this. I mean, you meet this guy, seems like a buddy at a bar. He's like, hey, can I grab your next drink? And you're like, yeah, sure. You don't think anything of it.
And to remind everybody, Connor was drugged at a bar.
With the same drugs that they're using in this case, GHB.
And it totally knocked you on your ass.
Yeah, I don't remember a single thing that happened that night.
Scary.
Very scary.
Well, very interesting, man.
I agree.
After learning all this information, I wanted to bring up these cases to Tony to get the scoop on just what might be happening in Lacrosse, Wisconsin.
Lacrosse was another hotbed. We knew about it because we had probably 6 or 7 at least drownings in 1 year, and then they make it seem, oh yeah, well, of course there are a lot of bars. There's probably more bars per capita than any other place, and there's at least 3 big colleges in the area, and of course the Mississippi goes right by all of it. So the running theory they have is these kids get drunk and then they fall in the river. I mean, just that fact alone. I mean, we were all young once. I'm a lot older than you, but I never fell in a river after drinking or anything. I mean, it's like they're zombies and it's magnetic and they go and they fall in the river. Oh, another drunk kid falls in the river. No. So we started looking at that and talked to a few people. Jeff Giese case was one of them. His father was all in. The validity of some of these search dogs, like the bloodhounds, are absolutely incredible. And we were told about all that, and then we went to our main goal next was, okay, well, let's find the living witness. So we did. We're like, okay, this kid survived it. So we went to interview him and pretty much proved that at a bar, him and his buddy both got drugged that night, and he fell in the river, or he woke up actually in the river, somehow pulled himself out by the grace of God. Yeah, I mean, it was like 32 degrees out. In 45 minutes, he's done. He's totally, exposed. He would have, hypothermia would have set in, and he was finished. And his buddy was just wandering around. He's lucky they didn't grab him too, and he has no recollection. And neither does the living witness. So we spoke to him, and then it just kept going from there. And it continued to occur. And we ended up working extensively on Luke Holman was another case, which was clearly there are people involved in that. There are named witnesses. There are events prior to him. On our show, we proved that he was murdered. He had a boot print on his forehead. So, and Luke was a big guy. He was a football player and a basketball player. So there were people. I guarantee there had to be at least 3 people trying to hold it down. They had a dog that scented him in a vehicle. They black lighted it. For people that don't know what the black light means, DNA shows up as bright spots. That was in the car. I mean, if you're going to go to that extent, and then try to cover it up or explain it away, don't bring in the dogs. Don't ask the questions if you don't want to hear the answer. And that was the main case that we worked on to bring us that in Lacrosse.
So with all these different hubs and clusters of these deaths, does that mean that there are like their own individual syndicates of a larger group that just operate in these cities?
Yeah, according to the one guy we spoke to, yeah, they call them chairs, that they have to prove themselves and then they get the chair in that city. And I guess what that entails is once you're a chair, you're doing things to bring in money and robberies and stuff like that. And there's the initiation of having to kill somebody or, in a certain way. So it doesn't look like murder, and I'm not beating up the police because they're always overworked, and to work on these things that way, it just takes a lot of manpower and proof, and then the DA's got to be on board. There's a whole series of events that have to happen to make this thing happen, and sometimes it's just easier to explain away. Well, yeah, they were drinking. Okay, now they fell in the river. I mean, and one disgraceful event that happened, the coroner at the time, I think he's since passed away. There was a big meeting of the city of Lacrosse, and he was speaking at it, and he says, oh yeah, we know who the killer is, alcohol. I mean, that's just a slap in the face to these people have been victimized and they just got victimized again. I found that to be atrocious. And besides, he's a coroner. And people don't really understand. Coroner, all they do is certified death. What does it take to be a coroner? I don't know. But you walk over, oh, yeah, that guy's dead. Okay, and then they send out to do a real autopsy. So that was disgraceful for him to say anything along those lines.
So do you think that, I guess my question is, how are they staying connected? Is it like there's an actual national person that they talk to, or like a dark web chat room? Like, how do these people organize?
It was through the dark web. There was one gentleman that they said they used to visit in New Orleans. I don't remember his name, but there was a certain ideology that he prescribed to that they followed. Not necessarily that he was, the main guy directing them specifically, but he was more than happy to give them direction and maybe what to look for and why and all those things. So I don't know if like the boss of bosses nationally, but definitely in certain areas of the country. So pretty much, yeah.
Is there any concept of them filming these murders, like keeping this stuff for making snuff movies, or is this just like a personal thing?
We don't have, as far as I can remember, we don't have any evidence to show that they filmed any of them for snuff movies. It's not to say they wouldn't. Now, of course, everybody has a cell phone. You can make like a movie, on your cell phone and all that stuff. Now, back 15, 20 years ago, might not have been as readily able to. Of course, they had the little mini cameras and stuff. So we don't know anything about that part. I haven't heard anything, but it wouldn't surprise me.
It's interesting because I deal a lot on my channels with these rings, but usually it's, like pet rings or these snuff film rings where it's, victimizing children or adults for some sort of a commercial value because they want to sell the films or they want to sell children. But with these cases, it seems to be kind of the opposite of that, where it's a very personal reason for killing these people. It's not for profit. It's like for them,
Yeah, based on the different ideologies, sometimes it's a reward thing. To them, they're taking someone's power from them and then using it for their own, like it's good for them, and that's why, I don't want to say it wrong, but the quality of the person, of course, all people deserve to live whatever they are, but these are more learned people, more accomplished, even though they're in college, they're scholarships, they're athletes, they're engineers. So in their warped mind and their ideology, they're more valuable to them to take their energy.
And they all have from what I could see, especially in Austin, they have a similar physical look to them. What would you describe that look as? Like, what's kind of the features of these typical victims?
Well, there's not any fat kids or skinny kids, or super tall or super short or anything like that. They're all, of a younger age, good build, healthy guys, accomplished, like I said, like athletes, or if they're not athletes, they were athletes. They're all narrowly focused. It's not like if you were to do a whole segment on the population and what that entails, you think you'd get, a wide variety of people that you get drunk and fall in a river. How come fat people don't get drunk and fall in a river? Or how come, somebody with a broken leg already doesn't fall in a river, or whatever the case might be. These are all healthy, accomplished people of essentially the same height and build, average or above average, healthy people. So that's another thing. Good question. What are the odds of that?
A couple drownings you'd imagine you could write off as a coincidence, but up in the hundreds at this point, it's no longer a coincidence. You have to have pattern recognition and be able to see clearly something is happening here.
I'm sure you looked at the Riley Strain thing, what happened to him. How do you fall 40 feet down almost a cliff with all rocks and everything and then not have any injuries from that? Hell, I'm stumbly enough. If I trip over here, I'll break my ankle. Forget about falling down 40 feet with rocks and everything else and then have no water in your lungs to say you drowned. Some of these things are almost preposterous to tell the family. How do you in good faith say, oh no, this is just another kid, he was stumbling. We have him on video stumbling. Okay, why was he stumbling? Okay. And then he's gone. And he fell down a 40-foot cliff with rocks. It makes no sense.
Yeah, it's really bizarre to me to see how there's always evidence that doesn't line up with, an accidental drowning. And for some reason they just throw it out the window and write it off. But that evidence paints such a bigger picture when you look at the whole thing. Why do you think the government and like local police forces, why do you think they don't want to look into this theory like seriously? Because when you type in smiley face, it immediately comes up like 3 articles down with the debunking, drowning the smiley face theory. It's like they've tried to silence you guys.
Well, some of the debunking is not even accurate to begin with. There was the homicide, what the heck is the name? The Center for Homicide Research said, well, it's not really this, it's not really that, so it's not smiley face. And people, take that like gospel. If you do a little further research on the Homicide Research Center, I can't even remember the name of the place exactly. The guy was a fireman. He's not an investigator. What the heck does he know? But they put that down because they want, oh yeah, no, this is debunked and forget about it. Because it's easier just to do that rather than, each jurisdiction has to have their own case and then picked up by the feds to then do it federally. So it's a big thing for them where they could just, well, yeah, we have no idea. And then they make the death, it's not a homicide, it's undetermined. So, well, we're not sure how he died, but he wasn't killed. We think he drowned. So a lot of times, they'll make it undetermined, and that kind of, in a way, gets them off the hook. But really what that should do is require much more investigation to find out exactly how he died. But a lot of jurisdictions don't do that. And that's part of the problem, is it would be such a gigantic case that should be looked at nationwide that at this point, they're not doing it.
I always wonder, from the moment someone's abducted to the moment that they're discovered in a river, it's usually a period of a couple of days, 2 to 5 days to even a couple months. What are your thoughts on what's happening to those men after they're taken between when they're found?
Unfortunately, that's where the biggest blind spot is. But what we do know, given the evidence of the livor mortis of their bodies, the lividity, usually the pooling of the blood settles 8 to 12 hours after they die. And so if someone dies on their right side on the ground, the lividity is going to indicate that. So the pooling of blood is going to be on their right side, on their torso. And they're found in this way. And yet the lividity indicates that they died on their backs or they died on their stomachs. And that they, in spite of being missing for 2 months, the post-mortem indicates that they've been alive for most of that 2 months, that they've only been dead for a couple of days. So that elicits that big question that you just asked. What happened in the interim? What was going on? With Patrick McNeil, I believe that kid was terrorized, and I believe that he was tortured with a blowtorch, actually. And he was held, he was missing for 50 days. His post-mortem indicates that he was only dead for 3 to 4 days, and the evidence on his body indicates that he was in a somewhat warm climate when he died. That's why there are fly larvae in his groin area. They don't hatch and grow on a body floating in a freezing river. That doesn't happen. So what happens to these kids? I'm going to tell you something that I haven't told anybody else, and it's just a hunch, it's a feeling, and I have very much operated by my intuition in all of this, because when I do, it tends to work out and tends to put me on the path toward like the truth ultimately, and that's why I do it. My thought when I asked that very question in the beginning of all this, what my gut told me was that these kids are taken to a secure location. They're not tortured after the fact. After Patrick McNeil, that was a close call, and other kids were tortured. There was one case in Lacrosse where the evidence pointed to exsanguination, the complete loss of blood. Like he was drained of blood, like he was hung upside down and drained of blood completely. So weird shit, but that was a case back in the late 90s, I believe. I don't think they're doing that anymore, but I think in the beginning, these kids, and maybe even now, were probably videotaped and being terrorized and psychologically tortured. They were scared. They were probably begging for their lives, and you have these people in masks telling them, you're dead, we're gonna kill you, you're gonna end up just like all those other kids in the river. How do you feel about that? You're dead, you're never getting out of here. And I think that fear gets some people off. That's why the red rooms, I think it still is a urban legend. Red rooms, places where kidnapped people are taken and tortured and videotaped for the dark web, and all these people pay like $25,000-$50,000 a pop to view the torture and ultimate murder of these victims. It's considered a urban legend. It's not an urban legend. They exist. These happen. These happen. And I think potentially that these kids are taped before they are murdered. And I think those tapes are probably distributed and sold. That's what I think is happening. That's why I think a lot of times these kids, when they're missing, it's not 1 or 2 days or 3 days. It's weeks, sometimes even months. If they're being murdered, they're being abducted, and then they're being murdered. And there's a period of time in which those two don't like line up. There's this empty space. That space of time points to extremely ill intentions, and I think that, you know, they are psychologically, sometimes even physically tortured and recorded. But I do believe that this is a group of highly sophisticated killers with 100% success rate. How many serial killers do we know of that have 100% success rate? None. We don't know them because the very fact that they have 100% success rate means that they float under the radar and that they are not known. There is a type of killer in this world that exists that is so good at killing, so good at murder, so good at hiding their crimes that they are never discovered. And that's what these guys are. So we're talking about very intelligent people. We're talking about people who probably do this because, I mean, to just level with you, like, you know this, like a lot of killers, they are on the sociopathic and psychopathic spectrums. You know, they probably, these killers have some degree of psychopathy. A lot of psychopaths are in high up positions. They are in government. They are like high powered lawyers. They're hedge fund managers. They're very smart people. They're very organized. They're real fucking good at what they do. It's the same with killing. These guys are that, but murderers, and they get off on it and they love it. And they love to flaunt these murders in front of the public. And you got 33% over here saying it's a conspiracy theory. You got 33% saying it's just accidental drownings, and the other 33% are like, oh no, these are murders. You know, they love that shit. It makes them happy. And I think sometimes the smiley face graffiti being found, I don't even think it's because it's their signature. I think they caught on to the fact that smiley faces were found, and Kevin and his team were talking about that aspect of the case, and they're like, you know what, let's f with people and let's leave smiley faces. Some people have discovered smiley faces after starting to investigate these cases. And the way that they found the smiley faces indicates that these people have very sophisticated means of surveillance, of watching what is happening, what you're saying, what you're writing, what you're typing online. And this isn't some podunk hillbilly group in down East Maine, which is where I grew up, so I can say that because I am one of those people, or I was one of those people. It's not like that. Like these are smart people. These are smart guys. I think that there is certainly certain ritualistic elements. I mean, you have a lot of people like going missing, getting abducted on like full moons. You have people getting abducted on Halloween and on like satanic holidays. They don't have their one signature. That's why I call them the rivermen and not the smiley face killers, because the smiley face graffiti isn't in every case, but the rivers are. The bodies of water are. They are the rivermen. That is the one lone signature tying them together. You have some victims who disappear in super mysterious circumstances. Like I think Brian Schaefer's case, he went to a bar and he never came out. The investigator on that case looked at the surveillance footage. He examined every single person and identified every single person. We're talking probably over 100 people that night who went in and came out. He said Brian Schaefer is the only one that went inside but never came out. The only place he could have gone was towards the back where there were no surveillance cameras. That alludes to a level of sophistication that we can't even really comprehend. So that's one case. And then another case, you know, some kid is waiting for this girl he's got a crush on in Minneapolis, is Jake Anderson, to leave a party, and he's standing outside just like Patrick McNeil was waiting for a girl at the Dapper Dog, and then he disappears. He's gone. He leaves inexplicably. And then you have some people who die of hypothermia, right beside a body of water, literally feet away from it, and some people are found in the water. Some people have water in their lungs, but some people don't. Some people are drained completely of blood, and some people aren't, you know, in a much more ambiguous state. You know, some people are found in a few inches of water, and some people are found in 20 feet of water. The one commonality is that they are found in bodies of water. The ritualistic aspect, it could just be another fuck you to us to obfuscate the truth.
So last question, what do you think, I guess it's like a two-pronged question, like why do you think there's never been a formal investigation into these crimes. Like, we're going to look into the river, murders. And what do you think would have to be done to finally get justice for these families?
Serial killers are bad for the economy. That's one aspect. Serial killers are bad for business. When you got this up and coming gentrified area, in Brooklyn or Austin, and you're trying to get more tourists to come in and spend their money and boost the economy of that up and coming location, the last thing that you want to do is tell the public there's a serial killer on the loose. The last thing that the investigative agencies want to do is admit that they fucked up, that there might be 12 cases in Austin, and the investigative bodies realize that after the third or fourth victim, there was a killer or killers on the loose, and they fucked up. And they have to report back to the other overarching investigative agencies and to the families and to everybody involved and say, hey, sorry, yeah, there was a serial killer. We didn't follow the trail of evidence correctly, and so 8 more people died. My bad. We'll start investigating it now, though. No, they'll lose their jobs. They will be publicly defamed. They will be shamed. You know what social media is now, and they will never live an anonymous life again. They're afraid. They're afraid. They're afraid of losing their jobs, their careers, their pensions, their families. They're afraid of being called out. They're afraid of being caught and complicit. So you have a lot of factors that, again, the killers are very aware of that just go against investigating these as homicides. And it's been that way for a while. That's what I think is potentially preventing these cases from being solved and being properly investigated. And I think that the only way to change that is to convince all parties involved who know something. All parties involved. Now I'm talking about investigators. I'm talking about police departments, medical examiners, morticians. I'm talking about eyewitnesses. I'm talking about fucking everybody. To scream from the rooftops what they have seen, what they know, what they think, and release that information, all of it, to the public. So when more people come together and start spreading that and releasing it, then we can have indictments. Then we can have these cases solved. That's what I hope happens.
At the end of the day, everything that I've just presented to you, in 99% of these smiley face drowning cases, they're all listed as accidents. Everybody from Lacrosse, it's just an accident. Most of the people from, Minneapolis, it's an accident. Most of the people from Chicago and Nashville and Austin, they're all just tragic accidents. I don't know why local authorities refuse to even look into these theories and these concepts that these aren't accidents. I mean, if I wanted to spend a whole day talking to you guys, I could. I would highly recommend reading Kevin and Tony's book that they published. I'll put the link in the description of this video about their findings, throughout all of these investigations. It's staggering. So many of these victims have had wounds and injuries that were inconsistent with drownings. Timelines and timetables they don't match. And then there's this code and the graffiti and the motifs that keep popping up. And like they said in the interview, they actually infiltrated one of these dark web groups. And I feel like Tony and Kevin have so much information that they're just waiting to release. I just can't wait for that day. And I can't wait for families to get justice and to be vindicated, because it's terrifying. Anybody around you could be a member of the Smiley Face Killer Gang. It could be your boyfriend sitting right next to you on the couch. It could be your wife of 20 years. It could be your son, your daughter, your grandson. You don't really know. These people don't walk out in public with shirts that say, I'm a serial killer, or hold up signs that say, watch out, I might try to kill you. That's the scary part about all of this. More than likely, they look like you and I. They look like me. They look like your brother and your sister. They're just normal folks with the darkest of desires. I'm just hoping that one day, authorities will take the smiley face murder theory seriously, because there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that none of these men died an accidental death. But until next time, thank you guys for tuning in. I know that this has been a long journey. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm sick right now, so I wasn't even going to record anything today, and I just decided to, so I didn't release this video late. But please make sure you leave a comment. Please like this video if you've enjoyed today's video. And yeah, stay safe out there, because in 9 cases out of 10, the evil that you're afraid of, that you think is thousands of miles away, is living right next door. I'll see you next week.
Once again, if you want to research your family tree and discover your family history, MyHeritage is a great place to start. You can use the link in the description or in the pinned comment to start your journey into your family history. MyHeritage, it's a company I love and a company that I think you guys will really enjoy.